Thank you very much. Notice that Elizabeth didn't really need to look at the paper when she made my introduction. That's because she spent many, many hours working on my application for this Chev Award. So I would like to publicly thank her for the time she devoted to that, because it wouldn't have happened without her. Thank you. So when thinking about guidelines, I can't help but wander back to the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the first one, which was the only good one. In the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, they're debating whether the pirate code is applicable in a certain set of circumstances. And one of the responses is, well, it really isn't a code. It's more like an informal set of guidelines. And so what I'm going to talk about is not a way we must think about energy. I'm not going to give you a bunch of empirical results or the results of my own research, but what I want to do is, I've been disturbed by the way the IQ of many intelligent people drops by about 20 points when they talk about energy policy. Everything is confused. So I want to develop a framework for thinking about energy policy. Two things on this first slide that I spend a lot of time thinking about. This is a reservoir in the Amazon, a hydroelectric reservoir. We tend to think of reservoir as a green energy source, but they're not. In the Amazon, in particular, the reservoirs are so big relative to the megawatts they generate that they can't cut the trees before they flood the reservoir. And so you get the trees dying and decaying and emitting methane. The greenhouse gas emissions of this reservoir are 10 times what they would be from a corresponding thermal plant. In this case, they would burn diesel instead of coal because they don't have coal there. 10 times the emission. People actually estimate that it might be possible to extract the methane from the water as it goes through the turbines. And of course, this is the famous graph of scenarios of climate change from the IPCC report. This is from the 2003 assessment, which shows that in the business as usual case, we're headed to 5 degrees Celsius of global warming. All right. Here's my first principle. Quit crying about gasoline prices. I actually don't know if Glenn Beck ever cried about gasoline prices, but when I Google searched clip art for a crying person, he jumped out at me. So, all right. And here's some information to back that up. This is the real price of gasoline versus the nominal price of gasoline going back to 1918. I put some vertical markers here to divide the period of time where the price of gasoline was below $2.50 a gallon. There's two things that are not shown in this graphic. One is it doesn't show the spikes in the price of energy. So in the summer, the price of energy for each year is higher than the average for the year. The other thing it doesn't show is that the quality of gasoline has increased a lot over this period of time. Those of us who are over 50 can remember when we were kids when our cars were always dying because of dirty gasoline. We've also taken the lead out of gasoline, and we've had to add detergents to gasoline because of the necessities of fuel injectors. And so if we actually look at the quality adjusted real price of gasoline, the more recent real prices would even be lower. There are spikes. But if we want to cry about something, don't cry about the real price of the price of gasoline. Cry about the fact that the real income of the lowest quartile of the population has declined over the last 15 or 20 years. All right, and that's why gasoline prices create hardships for people, is because it's their income hasn't kept up with inflation. It's actually gone down relative to inflation. Second principle is drill, baby, drill. is not an energy policy. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Third principle, I always tell my Environmental 110 classes, corn is evil. Corn is an environmental enemy. We are paying hundreds of millions of dollars a year in corn subsidies to create more flooding in the cities in the lower Mississippi, because we've converted all the wetlands to cornfields, to create a huge anoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and to actually have a negative impact on global climate change. Most of the estimates of the greenhouse gas emissions of the corn cycle are that it's roughly equivalent to extracting gasoline, or maybe a little bit worse than gasoline when you take into account the loss of soil carbon. Fourth principle is an end to coal as quickly as possible. Coal is another thing that's bad for everybody, except the owners of the coal enterprises. Coal creates local environmental impacts, as you can see. It's responsible for the mercury pollution in our oceans and has an incredibly big greenhouse gas impact. Kelly Cossey, who's a senior, is doing a really, senior in environmental studies and poverty, is doing a really important capstone research project in which she shows an empirical relationship between coal mining and poverty in West Virginia counties. She shows that controlling for the level of ruralness of the county, and she uses 3 different measures of ruralness, that the more coal mining, the more poverty. And the underlying hypothesis of this is that coal mining drives out other economic activity. Amazon.com does not locate a call center here, for example. Okay, now these are kind of, the first few principles were important, but they were kind of in jest as well. Here are the things that we need to think about. And I'm not going to go through the list and read them, because I'm going to talk about them individually. So let's go to the first one, and that's irreversibility. And the idea of irreversibility is if we have a particular technology, and in the future we decide it's a bad idea because new technologies have come along, we're stuck with the negative consequences of the original technology. So for example, dams for hydropower, the global climate implications of burning coal or oil, storing nuclear waste. The decisions to go in those directions are irreversible. On the other hand, if we decide to go to wind power, maybe we don't like it because it's ugly, maybe we don't like it because we think it's going to kill some birds, but if we go to wind power and 30 years from now we decide it's a bad idea because we've got better solar energy, for example, or maybe there's an innovation in fuel cells, we take them down and recycle them. It's a completely reversible decision. We take them down and recycle them, and we're not stuck with the negative environmental consequences. We build cars from the steel of the towers. Diversification. People who are amateur or serious investors know how risk is reduced when you diversify your investment portfolio. Even adding risky investments, if they're uncorrelated with the rest of your bundle, it lowers your overall risk. And this is why drill baby drill is not a good environmental policy, because it doesn't represent a diversification. Whatever we get, for example, if we're concerned about the economic impacts of the price of oil, whatever we get off the Atlantic coast, whatever we get off of Anwar, whatever we get out of fracking, it's correlated to the world price of oil, and it'll move along. So that's not diversifying our portfolio. Another reason for diversifying our portfolio is that with any individual technology, we have capacity constraints. There are only a certain amount of areas that are good for wind. Solar is better in some areas. I'm going to talk later about how if we're thinking about biofuels, we should go to the biofuels that are produced on degraded lands. Right. So there are capacity constraints there. We can't produce all of what we want of a particular technology. And then the other thing is, if we have a diverse portfolio, and there's a certain amount of randomness associated with technological innovation. A lot of innovations have been by accident. We have a greater probability of coming up with technological breakthrough if we have a very diversified portfolio. The next principle is externalities. For those people in the audience who haven't taken an economics course, these are the unintended consequences of an action. It's a cost that you impose on others from the economic decision you make. So when you drive your car, you're paying for the gasoline, you're paying for the wear and tear on your car, and so on, but you're not paying for the additional congestion you impose on other people, the local environmental impacts of the fumes, or the global climate impacts. National security is another big externality associated with our reliance on Persian Gulf oil. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Other environmental problems that we need to be aware of. That's why coal is a non-starter, because of the local environmental impacts and economic impacts. It's destroying West Virginia and other areas of the Appalachians, mercury and so on from coal. But also we have to think about the environmental impacts of hydropower. We don't have many free-flowing rivers left in the United States. We don't have many free-flowing rivers left in the world. We tend to think of hydropower as green because it doesn't have fumes coming out of it, but it has other environmental impacts. Okay, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the national security externality, or what we're paying to keep the oil flowing from the Persian Gulf. In 2011, we imported 680 million barrels of Persian Gulf oil. All right, for every $500 billion in military costs, and I'm deliberately expressing it this way because it's hard to say what percentage of our military expenditures is due to keeping the oil and, you know, what percentage is due to other relationships with Israel or other things. But, you know, think about the cost of the Persian Gulf War, which is the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf War. And I really don't believe that the World Trade Tower would have been bombed if we hadn't been propping up the Saudi regime in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden was concerned about events in Saudi Arabia, not the Israel-Palestine conflict. It was Saudi Arabia. But for every $500 billion per year in military costs, which is probably an underestimate of what we're paying, there's an additional social cost per gallon of gasoline of $10. And this is just a relatively easy computation. Just multiply the number of barrels by the price of the barrel and divide by the number of gasoline, the number of gallons of gasoline per barrel, and you'll come up with something like $10 per cost of gasoline. In contrast, the global climate costs associated with gasoline or oil, or with anything, is high estimates are around $200 a ton. $200 a ton damages from a ton of carbon would translate to about 15 cents in a gallon of gasoline. So this is orders of magnitude higher, the national security externality. Not that global climate change is unimportant, but we have to be concerned about that. Okay. Third issue is the role of policy. I mean, people are always talking about how less government is better. But a problem as vexing as the energy problem, with solutions as complicated as the energy problems, we have to have policy. We can't leave it to the market or individual actions, or we'll never get a solution. So the first thing is full social cost of energy. When you pay for a gallon of gasoline, you should pay for all the costs. Not just the cost of production, but the cost of pollution and national security and other things. The second thing is the provision of public goods. Lots of our new technologies require investments in infrastructure. So if we don't have any way to get wind energy to the markets. We don't have any good way to get biofuels to the markets right now. You have to put the biofuels in trucks, which really limits the economic profitability because and the environmental benefits, because after you drive for a while, you generate as much environmental harm as you would if you're using fossil fuels. The transmission lines from the areas that have wind power aren't sufficient to cover the wind power. And as Professor Crawley was talking about several weeks ago, the grid is not prepared to handle solar energy from a multiplicity of sources. And so one can view these as private goods because clearly they could be provided by the electric utilities. Clearly they could be provided by the generators of the energy. But like many goods, it has both private property characteristics or private good characteristics and public good characteristics. And so we're not going to get these technologies getting started unless we have the appropriate infrastructure to bring them into the system. The third one, the role of government in sponsoring and stimulating research and development, has been horribly confused by the problems that Solyndra had. All right. The argument for government sponsorship of research and development, either by providing it in its own national labs, by providing grants or to university professors, that's my preferred option, or by providing interest-free loans to industry. There are three major reasons for that. The first is that these investments in alternative energies are really risky. And for any individual company to invest a lot of money in a particular technology is very dangerous economically. The company may cease to exist if the technology doesn't turn out. And so that risk is very, very high. If it fails, it's a catastrophe. But if we spread the risk over many people, the cost to each of us of absorbing the Solyndra problem is only a couple dollars per person. Also, as we invest in many, many different technologies, and some prove worthless, but if only a few turn out to be good energy technologies, they pay for all the things that went bad. So if we have a very diverse portfolio of many, many different types of investment, and we know these are risky investments, but we know if we have a big enough portfolio, some of them are going to succeed, we expect companies like Solyndra to go bankrupt. We expect some people to crap out. It's just the nature of risky investments. Now, Solyndra, I think, had a very stupid business plan, because they're in an industry where they're betting on technological innovation. and yet that they're going to make their own technological innovation, and yet their own financial success, their own economic success, hinged on no fall in the price of solar cells. Well, if everybody else is successful in improving technology, the price of solar cells is going to fall. It's a good thing that Solyndra went bankrupt, because that shows us that we've made a lot of progress in solar energy. And so I think the whole debate about Solyndra is a lot of excitement about nothing. I mean, maybe you know, there were people in the Obama administration that approved the loan. There were people in that administration that maybe didn't look carefully enough at the business plan. But the point is, we expect a lot of energy investments to go bankrupt because they're risky. Some will work, some won't. And then the last reason for government sponsorship is it's very easy to copy innovations. We have patent laws, but patent laws can be gotten around. You just can't follow the exact same patterns. So what happens is, if you invest a lot in research and development and you're successful, you can earn monopoly profits for a while. So for example, and an example for the students, I don't know if this is an example for the faculty unless you've got young kids, but when was it Nintendo that did Wii? When Wii came out, it was the first game that you could actually play sports on by mimicking the movements of a tennis racket or whatever. And the price was really high until Xbox and everybody else copied that same style of game. They didn't violate the patents, but they copied the style, and the benefits of Nintendo were very short-lived. They were shared with the other companies that didn't invest as much in the research and development. In a kind of game theoretic fashion, it may always pay to be a follower rather than a leader. Because if you follow other people's innovations, you eventually reach some of the benefits. If you're the leader and you are successful, everybody will copy you and your benefits are short-lived. And of course, if you're not successful, nobody's going to follow you down the bad path. How long am I supposed to talk?
How much more do you have?
I could talk till midnight, but I won't do that. All right. The third kind of guideline is to think about directionality. And there's two aspects of the directionality. One is in-out, and that's the flow of wealth into or out of a country. And our reliance on Persian Gulf oil is a net outflow because that money tends to stay there. It doesn't wind up back in the hands of our citizens. So if, for example, instead of buying Persian Gulf oil, we bought ethanol from Brazil, instead of that money going to buy palaces in some Persian Gulf country or whatever, or be invested in investments that don't create any jobs in the United States or other countries. If we bought ethanol from Brazil or an African country or something like that, they would buy our stuff with the income that they received. Or maybe they'd buy stuff from Germany, and Germany would buy stuff from France, and France would buy stuff from us. The point is that all the arguments about the economic efficiency of international trade and comparative advantage in international trade arise when we trade for energy with a different set of partners than we're trading right now. All right, up and down, the directionality up and down refers to the flow of carbon. And so we have a flow of carbon that's purely up. That's when we use stored carbon, like oil or natural gas or coal, and burn it, and the carbon is released into the atmosphere. There's a carbon cycle where plants pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We convert the plants into a type of energy, and then we burn that and the carbon is released into the atmosphere. That is not a cycle with no leakage. All right, because we use energy inputs when we grow the plants, we use energy inputs when we convert the plants into alcohol or biodiesel, and so on. So it's not like we're having no climate change impact. And as I said with the case of corn, depending on what's happening on the land, biofuels could actually be negative. If you're cutting down rainforests to put in palm oil plantations like they're doing in Indonesia, that's it definitely is a net increase in global climate change. And then something in directionality that we haven't talked about much lately, we've talked about it in one aspect, and that's the flow down. That's carbon coming out of the atmosphere and being sequestered terrestrially. So reforestation and preservation are ideas that are a flow down of energy. But also artificial sequestration is on the horizon, where oil where carbon is captured from smokestacks and stored underground. Right now, this is thought to be, the last information I had was several years old, it was about 25 or 30% efficient. So for every kilogram of carbon we stored underground, we use 75% of a kilo to store it there. So our net gain was only a quarter kilo. But there are possibilities for this for a lot of technological innovation in this area, and this is going to relate directly to another area that we need to think about, and that is sequencing. And we'll get to that in a second. Innovation potential. Let me go to the second bullet first. There's not much innovation potential in internal combustion engines. Internal combustion engines are inherently inefficient. We only capture about 25% of the energy. We lose a lot to heat. We lose a lot to unburned hydrocarbons. We lose a lot transferring motion that goes like that to motion that goes like that. We lose a lot in friction and so on. And there hasn't been much efficiency in internal combustion engines since the Model T Ford. There's been different choices we've made, but there hasn't been a whole lot of innovation. In contrast, in solar energy, there's just tremendous potential for innovation, because as we hit one barrier in one technology, and Professor Crawley was talking about this several weeks ago. As we hit one barrier to technology, we begin to think about ways to circumvent that barrier, and all of a sudden that reveals a different technology that we can follow, and we've doubled what we believe to be the limits on, in the last 5 years we've doubled our perception of what we believe to be the limits of converting sunlight into energy for exactly these reasons. Hydropower is another area where we would not expect much technological innovation, because turbine engines have been around, turbine generators have been around a long time, and a lot of the ability we have for technological innovation, such as reducing friction and so on, we've already taken advantage of those. Okay, let's skip this one because I'm short on time. Sequence is a critically important issue. When I first thought about giving this talk, I was going to focus entirely on sequence, but I thought maybe looking at other principles of policy might be a good idea as well. All right, we need to have short-run solutions, where we go in the next couple years. We need to have medium-run solutions, and we need to have long-run solutions. And what we need to understand is that our choices in the short run are going to affect our options in the medium and long run, and our choices in the medium run are going to affect the options that are available to us in the long run. So, for example, I think right now we should really move towards rechargeable hybrid cars and move towards burning alternative fuels in those cars, biodiesel and ethanol. That technology is there. In Brazil, you can burn any combination from 100% ethanol to 100% gasoline in the same car. You don't have to make any adjustments whatsoever. It's all software. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, we've got electric engines are much more efficient. So we want to be moving towards a future of electric cars. And the way to start moving on that future of developing better batteries and so on, technological innovation in batteries, is to move towards rechargeable hybrids now. And eventually those rechargeable hybrids are just going to move to rechargeable electric cars. Why not just go to biofuels and just have internal combustion biofuel cars? Well, I already talked about the inefficiency of internal combustion engines, but also sometime in the future, good sequestration technology is going to be available, capturing carbon from smokestacks. We are never going to be able to capture the carbon coming out of the exhaust pipe of a car. It's just physically impractical. So as we move to a future where sequestration is more and more efficient, we move towards burning those biofuels in our electric plants instead of our cars, and sequester the carbon that those biofuels pulled out of the sky. Another example. Right now, a problem with wind power is storage of the electricity, because wind power is generated at night and the demand for electricity is much less at night. But if lots of people had rechargeable hybrid cars, they would get home at night, plug in their cars, and recharge at night when there's a lot of wind power. So we're actually storing the electricity in the cars. All right? So the existence of electric cars is going to spur the development of wind power. And the existence of wind power is going to spur the development of electric cars. So if we have a policy that incentivizes both, we'll get to a cleaner, cheaper energy future much more quickly than if investors are kind of thinking about investing in one, not knowing what's going to happen with the technology and investments in the others. There are lots of these kind of chicken and egg type of problems associated with the implementation of energy technology, where sequence really matters, and some investments aren't going to take place unless other investments come first. And so that's another thing we have to think about. Poverty and food security is a big issue as well. These are big social issues, particularly in developing countries. And some of you may have read several years ago how the big push to corn ethanol hurt small communities in Mexico who couldn't afford to buy food because the price of corn had gone up. All right, we need to think about those issues, which is another reason why corn is a stupid idea. Now, what Brazil has done with biodiesel is a really great example of how you can attack all these things at the same time. So Brazil decided to go to biodiesel. And right now they're at 6% biodiesel. So any diesel that's sold in Brazil has to be 6% biodiesel by law. And what they did was they created a system of subsidies for biodiesel. But the subsidies are only available to small farmers who are working on degraded land. Small farmers in poverty-stricken areas are eligible for these subsidies. Giant industrial soybean growers are not eligible for these subsidies. And so they have crops that grow on degraded lands. Castor bean is one of the chief sources of biodiesel in Brazil. Not competition with food. It'll grow on land where corn and soybean won't grow. Palm trees can grow on degraded land as well. And so the subsidies go to the small farmers, and basically what happens is Petrobras, which is the big national oil company, goes to the governor of the state and says, we guarantee to buy, the biodiesel from 600,000 acres of land for the next 5 years at this price. And then they get a subsidy from the federal government too. And so that relieves a lot of the uncertainty on the part of farmers. They know that if they grow castor beans, they're going to receive income from it. Another big problem with sequencing is that because there aren't pipelines, this is true in the United States too, because there are not pipelines, farmers here can't start growing switchgrass for ethanol, because there's no refineries nearby to convert the ethanol into switchgrass into ethanol. And so if they're trucking it to some very distant location, so you need to have the refineries going in at the same time that the farmers are thinking about growing the crops. If the farmers will never think about growing the crops unless there's refineries, investors aren't going to put in the refineries unless they're guaranteed a feedstock. So again, we need coordinated policy. Okay, so these are a set of general recommendations, and then I'm going to get to some very specific ones. Correctly price fossil fuels. This is really, really important. Investment in alternative technologies. Partnerships with other countries. We have comparative advantages in some areas of science. Other countries have comparative advantages in other areas of science. And this is really, the fourth one is really important, is we have to think about technologies that'll be useful in developing countries as well. Because the future of the global planet is not going to be so much determined by what the US and Europe does, by what China and India and the other big rapidly industrializing countries are doing. So if China goes to one car per family, which is a lot less than we have in the United States, one car per family with gasoline-driven cars, it's a very different implication than if they go to electric cars which are powered by electricity that's generated by the wind or solar or not coal. Okay, I already mentioned my recommendations for cars and trucks. Planes, it's a little bit more difficult, but I know of at least two airlines, United and TAM, which is the National Brazilian Airlines, that have already flown big jetliner flights with 100% biofuels. Eliminate the hub system. The hub system generates a lot of inefficiency, a lot of extra miles of transport. The hub system is designed to bring small airplanes into a central location and bring big airplanes from that location to another central location, and then small airplanes going out. If you had some smaller airplanes, if you had a system of mini hubs, it would lower the amount of miles that are driven or flown. All right, investment in infrastructure, biofuels and thermal plants, massive investment in solar power, massive investment in wind power, and moving towards looking at carbon sequestration in the future. One thing that we haven't talked about much is land use in association with energy. We need to penalize destruction of ecosystems, and we could do this through a system of credits and taxes in an international treaty. Make it costly for people to convert ecosystems, and make it costly to lose soil carbon. Reward carbon cycling and carbon sequestration on previously degraded land. Potential for storage of carbon is just immense. Mackenzie Doss, who's doing a capstone on mangroves and carbon storage, there is so much carbon stored in the soils of mangroves. Mangroves have much more carbon per hectare than tropical forests do even, because of the soil carbon. And yet, we're losing mangroves worldwide at a really rapid rate, and employ extreme caution in planning new hydropower. Okay, and the question you might ask is, how can we afford to do all this? And I would respond to that question with a question, and that's, how can we afford not to? Okay, any questions for my questions?
How much do you think that sort of a continuing, use of all of our resources for the oil companies really is sort of a plot? And how much is it just natural, economic choices being made? Because I hear all these conspiracy theories all the time about how, it's these oil companies that want to do it to make everybody stay dependent on oil. President Obama wants a giant, price of gas because that'll be helpful to him. It's just really irritating to hear all the conspiracy theories. So what does an economist think about this?
I mean, there can be explicit conspiracies and implicit conspiracies. And I think the way our system of campaign finance works, it can generate outcomes that might be similar to a conspiracy, even if a conspiracy doesn't actually exist. Clearly, energy companies have an incentive not to go to decentralized sources of energy. I forgot to talk about conversion of waste to energy, which is something we really need to be thinking about doing. So we use all this energy to make our hamburgers and bread and everything we eat, and then we literally flush that energy down the toilet. We should be recovering that energy. But there's little incentive for a company like Exxon to invest in that, because then each city becomes an energy producer. Exxon is losing market share to each city that converts the sewage into methane or into syngas, and there's several different technologies for doing this. There's biodigestion into methane, there's pyrolysis into syngas, and there's thermal depolymerization into natural gas and oil. So there's a lot of technologies that are available, but it's decentralizing, it's taking stuff off the grid. So the companies that have a lot of, I don't think it's so much a conspiracy, but the companies that have a lot of resources to do the investment, they have little economic incentive to make that investment because they lose market share and they can't capture a lot of the market share of the new technology. But things like, the waste to energy, and we can talk about other kinds of waste like fuel waste. And by the way, Ken, we might want to think about a conversion of sewage to natural gas here on campus, because we do have the sewage pipe of the city of Lexington flowing right through campus. And it might make sense to have some people in the engineering department or an outside consultant do a quick analysis if that would be something that would be even feasible. I don't know much about the economics of that at the small scale, but it's something we might want to think about. So to answer your question, I mean, certainly George W. Bush had a lot of oil people in his cabinet. Conspiracy, I don't know. There are other things that I do think are conspiracies, but that's not necessarily one of them. Robert?
One of the things you mentioned in your short-run solutions was rechargeable solutions, like rechargeable. It's just one example of a technology that's heavily reliant on additional resources, like rare earth elements. And mining some of those rare earth elements could have ecological consequences of their own that we don't understand yet. Just like we're starting to understand the ecological consequences of wind generation. If we choose short-run solutions that are feasible, but we don't really understand the ecological consequences of them, how do we sort of not just invest in research and development, but also ecological research to try to head off additional problems that those might cause and, basically trade the devil we know for the devil we don't?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And it's a question in which I think it's important to employ the precautionary principle instead of some kind of optimizing principle. Not necessarily choose the paths that are, maximize the net present value of the expected outcomes, but to think about avoiding walking off cliffs. And so I think that's a good point. I don't know enough about engineering to know if battery technology is available that doesn't use the rare earths. And I do know that the rare earths are found principally in China.
Salt flats in South America and Central America.
Yeah, and so I mean that's a really good question. And I'm not trying to say that anything I'm saying is a perfect solution. And in fact, if you go to this list of issues to think about, very often they'll conflict with each other, and that you have to try and strike a balance. But one thing is clear, is that we're not making progress. We are going back to this diagram. We're just moving up this business as usual scenario. Kyoto Protocol didn't do anything to get us off that business as usual scenario. And there is no effective treaty on climate change available in the near future. I used to think, when I first started working on Amazonian issues, that carbon credits were going to be the magic bullet that saved the rainforest, that they were going to pay for protecting all the other ecological services. Now I think payments for some of those ecological services may actually protect the carbon instead of the other way around.
When you discuss basically some kind of policy for analyzing destruction of ecosystems, doesn't that kind of create a competitive disadvantage for businesses if you were to implement that only in the United States?
No, this would have to be I mean, we can have our own policy however we want to protect our environmental resources. And as a matter of fact, we have lots of unproductive land that can be converted into energy crops. For example, the cow-calf operations here, they make little money or they lose money, Robert?
Some people say you can make more money on the conservation subsidy programs. Basically, protecting land, you can make more money than using it to raise.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not a strong economic activity, and if all of these unproductive pastures in Virginia were converted to switchgrass, for example, we could have a big source of ethanol without converting any of our forests. There would be less runoff into our streams. There would be more carbon sequestered because you don't plow the switchgrass up at the end of the year. You cut it a couple times a year for the crop, and in the meantime you have roots that are 3 meters deep, and you're building soil carbon and so on. So your point is a good point. but I think we can do it with land that's already taken out of ecosystems. And in particular, you know, if we convert a lot of the corn land back into wetlands, but in wetland energy crops, species of long grasses, I forgot the name, Menthancum? What? It starts with an M. I don't remember. Miscanthus. That it's very tolerant of inundation. And so you could actually have wetlands storing the rainwater so that the Mississippi system doesn't flood, and at the same time be producing an energy crop, rather than us paying a lot of money per person for the corn subsidies that's creating all these negative environmental impacts, particularly on the Gulf of Mexico. And in developing countries, that's the same case. But what you could have is you could have it built into a treaty. And right now we have the technology to monitor that. It would just cost a couple $2 billion a year to do an annual 3-spectrum radar image of the world, of the land areas of the world. And that tells you what the land cover is. And so you could monitor that. I say just a couple billion. But, you know, when you take a look at the, you know, $500 million loan to Solyndra, a couple billion is not that much money. John?
A couple of points. First, a small point with regard to Solyndra. The case there, I think, is stronger than you made it even.
The what is stronger?
The case that, so that was a good effort for the United States to take. Because it's true that they failed in part because of innovation elsewhere. But I'm told by people who really know they had a good product. They went up with the innovation. What really killed them was Chinese subsidies to solar panels. And that was something we couldn't control. But then
yeah, but you know and the case for the Chinese subsidy. I think you were making this point the other day, weren't you, Larry? That it's hard to tell what's a subsidy when you have a declining cost industry.
Well, they were subsidizing it in the exchange rate.
Oh, everything out of China is subsidized in the exchange rate. Yeah.
But then, in response to this gentleman's question, maybe you should add to your list of things there, foreign policy, because after all, the major environmental problems are global. There's one atmosphere, there's one set of oceans, and you have to deal with the problem in the domain in which it occurs. So, maybe...
Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk much about international treaties, which clearly are important. We're not going to get anywhere unless we have an international treaty on climate change, an effective international treaty on climate change with participation by the BRIC countries.
It has even occurred to me that this may be the issue that eventually drives the world to a world government, because it will be the only way we can survive.
I don't know if you need to go that far. I think... Yeah. I think if the world moved to a system of carbon taxes, well-monitored, well-enforced carbon taxes, that we could do that without an overriding authority, because it would be in each government's economic interest to collect the taxes, particularly in developing countries where they have a hard time collecting income tax and stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah. Given the two constraints, one is the environmental impact, and of course the great debate about the impacts of climate change there's not a consensus as yet. But there's also constraints on just the supply of the fossil energies. And I just, as an economist, you're an economist that is aware of natural constraints. Can we have continuous, a sustainable, continuous growth economy?
Okay, let me answer your question in part. First, I need to object to your first statement. There's a great debate on climate change. There's a great spin on climate change.
Don't get me wrong. I'm a believer that something happens, and I just realized
the evidence
Yeah.
points to the fact that global climate change has occurred, that it's been caused by human activity, and that there will be additional global climate change in the future as a result of anthropogenic carbon emissions. There's no debate on that. I have had a long-standing set of arguments with a gentleman by the name of Brian Check. I think you know him, Robert.
Brian
Check, C-Z-E-C-H. He runs an NGO called the Zero Growth Institute or something like that. And he's making the argument that we have to move to zero growth immediately in order to protect the planet. I think that argument is that idea is a non-starter because nobody's going to agree to it. And I believe that right now the most important thing is to change the mix of economic activity rather than worrying so much about the level of the economic activity. We choose the wrong mix in many circumstances, and if we went to a society that was based on greener energy, if we went to a society that was based on more conservation of energy, if we went to a society that was based more on the consumption of services than on the consumption of material goods. So, you know, instead of spending more money on, you know, more clothes and more stuff, have someone come in and give you a back massage. Spend your money on that. You know, spend your money going to more concerts. Spend your money on more art and so on, and less on stuff that results in a lot of use of energy in its manufacture and less energy in its consumption. So the mix, I think, is what we need to get under control in the short run, and in the long run, we can look at some of the work by people like Herman Daly and so on that suggests that we need to think about a steady state economy. But I think the central point of people like Daly, that what we want to do is minimize what he calls throughput. And throughput is stuff that comes into the economic system and goes out of the economic system. So we have inputs, we use a lot of inputs, we create products, but we emit a lot of waste. So what we want to do is store stuff in the middle and reuse and recycle stuff in the middle, so there's less coming out of the environment and less going back into the environment. And if we use this as a guiding principle, which we can move in that direction right now by getting prices correctly charging people for energy, correctly charging people for waste disposal, and so on. We can get there very fast without having to wait till people's values change. And you know, it's hard to tell whether policy leads values or values lead policy. I think it's a little bit of both. I think, you know, for those of us who are old enough to remember the civil rights movement, it was a combination of both. It was values changing in the United States. It was people expressing those values that got the federal government to make some changes. And those changes that the federal government made helped change the values of other people. And I think the same thing can be true in energy and environmental policy. We don't have to wait to convince everybody to be good environmental citizens. We can start moving them in that direction with good policy, and as we do that, values are going to change over time. So we need to approach it both with changing values and with implementing effective policy immediately.
Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you.